So here's our class for the next 2 weeks, this Generating Mobile Apps with BAM. That's Business Application Modeling is what the BAM part stands for. And we'll be talking a lot about BAM and Genero Mobile this morning during our overview chapters. So this class is based on Genero Mobile 1.1. We've been working on it for a while. We actually started working on the course when Genero Mobile 1.0 was the version available. And it's kind of extended our working over into Genero Mobile 1.1. But 1.1 is what all your labs and examples will be based on. So the first lab that you do in this class, which will actually be today's lab, is to install Genero Mobile 1.1. Now if you already have Genero Mobile 1.1 installed, you can skip that part of the lab sessions. You might just want to check it out and make sure you're not missing anything, but you'll be all set for tomorrow's lab. So the course objectives are here. So by the end of this class, you should be able to install Genero Mobile, that's our lab for today, and configure the Genero Studio environment to develop and run mobile apps. Now Genero Studio comes with Genero Mobile. That's our IDE that we have for Genero Mobile. So it has all kinds of components and tools available to help you with the development process. And I'll give you a short tour of Genero Mobile and Genero Studio later on today. Today also you'll learn how to configure an Android emulator. The emulator is what we'll be using for labs the next 2 weeks. Now you can certainly work with your own Android device or iOS devices like your iPhone if you like, but for the lab processes, we'll be using the Android emulator. We'll talk about the BAM modeling diagrams, and you'll learn to use the BAM modeling diagrams to design an application. Learn how to build and run applications with BAM. We'll talk about mobile form patterns, and you'll learn to use the mobile form patterns effectively. And then we'll also, even though we're using a code generator for the labs this week, that's what BAM is for, it generates our code for us, we'll also learn that you can add custom logic to the generated code if and when you want to, and we'll talk about how to do that and common reasons why people do add some custom logic. So we'll see some examples. And then finally the last chapter, on Friday of next week, we'll talk about how to package and distribute a mobile app. So those are our course objectives. Here's our 10 chapters for the next 2 weeks. Today we'll start out with the first two, Genero Mobile and BAM will be our first chapter today, and we'll also do the development environment, the second module. And that's the first lab that you'll do is actually the second chapter. The Genero Mobile and BAM chapter is just an overview. So we'll be talking about Genero Mobile and what it does, and we'll talk about BAM and what it does and what it's most useful for, but there won't be a lab associated with Module 1. So we have 10 chapters. First 2 will be today, as I mentioned a minute ago. Tomorrow we'll start out with Chapter 3, which talks more in detail about how to model an app, and you'll actually have a lab where you go in and model a couple of entities in your BAM diagram and get all set up to be able to generate some code. We'll also talk about modeling the database. Now, modeling the database may be tomorrow or it may be Wednesday, depending on how long it takes us to get through Module 3. So we're just going to play those 2 chapters by ear. When we get to Module 5 on forms, that's a pretty big chapter. So Module 5 will be done all by itself. It'll have a whole day dedicated just to forms because forms is a very big topic. The same goes for Module 6 on form behavior, where we start talking about the properties that you can configure in a form to affect what happens when a user opens a form, what mode it's in, that type of thing. That too is a fairly big topic, a lot of interesting things in that chapter, so it too will be in a chapter all by itself. Then Module 7 is talking about the details of the generated code. We'll talk about what happens when the code gets generated, what you should expect to see out there in your directory structures and how it happens, And then we'll also go through and talk about the BDL language basics. We'll talk more about BDL today as well, give you an introduction to the idea, but that's the language that you use when you use Genero Mobile. And when you use BAM, our application modeling tool, it's creating or generating code in this BDL language. The BDL stands for Business Development Language, and we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. The custom code module will address how you go about adding custom code, how you find the right place in the generated code to add your own customized code, and some common examples of why you might want to do that. You may be able to get along just fine without any custom code, but there's a few places where you might find it to be some benefit. Chapter 9 on advanced topics I think is a very interesting chapter. We'll talk about some of the things we don't commonly use with applications like web components. We'll talk about how to integrate web components into our generated code. That involves custom coding, by the way, so that's one of our reasons why sometimes you might want to add some custom code to your BAM generated applications. You may want to integrate web components so that you can use third-party graphical components in your application. You might also want to do things like synchronize with a back-end database. All of those types of things would involve some custom coding. So we'll address custom coding in these custom code chapter in Module 8 and as well in this advanced topics chapter, Module 9. And then finally on Friday of next week, our Chapter 10 is talking about once you have your application ready for deployment, or it could be another testing step for that matter, we'll learn how to package and deploy the application. So that's Module 10. So there's our 10 chapters. Move on. And let me pause here for just a second before we go ahead and start Module 1 today. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand or send me a message in the chat interface. Whichever one you're most comfortable with is fine. All right, so that concludes the first module. We really didn't count Module 0. That's Module 0, believe it or not. So this is our first real module of the day, is Module 1, which is an overview of Genero Mobile and BAM, the business application modeling tool that's provided with BAM. Let me get this just right. Okay, I notice here that it says Genero Mobile 1.0. So just FYI, that should be Genero Mobile 1.1. So our lab this afternoon will be to install and configure Genero Mobile 1.1. So by the end of this module, this first module of the day, you should be able to describe the features of Genero Mobile, describe the types of Genero Mobile applications. We'll talk about the features of BAM, our business application modeling, in this chapter. We'll talk a bit about the BAM design process and the modeling diagrams that are how you do your work in BAM. And we'll talk some about the code generation template set and how code generation works. And we'll also, at the end, navigate Genero Mobile and BAM-related components of Genero Studio. And what that really means is that I'll do a demo at the end of the chapter and just show you around Genero Studio. If you're not familiar with that, we'll take a look at some of the components in Genero Studio that are related to the class for the next 2 weeks. And then I'll also show you just a small amount of BAM at this point because we have additional chapters today where we'll talk more about BAM. All right, so let's go ahead and start this Introduction to Genero Mobile topic that we have in Module 1. So I'm getting some good comments and some good feedback from you guys. I appreciate it. That makes me know at least you're still there and you can hear me okay. So here's our first introductory topic. That's really what this chapter is all about. So the first thing we're looking at is what is Genero Mobile. So Genero Mobile lets you visually create and deploy native mobile business apps. So by visually create, we're talking about BAM, this business application modeling component of Genero Studio that we're going to be looking at for the next 2 weeks and starting out with today. You can also, as well as generate with this business application modeling tool, BAM, you also have the option, of course, of coding by hand. So whichever you're most comfortable with is fine with Genero Mobile. Some folks mix it up a bit and primarily generate the code with the generator, the business application modeling code generator. And then if and when you get ready to, you can go in and add some custom code, which we'll learn all about later next week, actually. You can develop and debug your app using Genero Studio, which is the Genero integrated development environment. It's been so long since I've talked about it, I've forgotten what IDE stands for. We're just used to saying IDE now. But it's the integrated development environment. You can run the app within this development environment right there inside of Genero Studio. And it's very convenient because you can run the debugger from right there inside Genero Studio. Just pop in and out of the debugger anytime you get ready. And of course, Genero Studio also has some very handy development tools. Code editor, for example, that makes it very simple to edit custom code if you feel the need. The form designer that you can use to modify and enhance your forms. And of course, we even use Genero Studio to access all the components of BAM. So Genero Studio is just an integrated part of Genero Mobile that gives you access to all of these development tools that we'll be looking at for the next 2 weeks. Now you can run the app in the development environment right there inside of Studio, and then you can view your app, run your app on a physical device like an iOS device or an Android device, or you can view the app on an emulator. And for the class labs the next 2 weeks, we'll actually be using an emulator. So that's one of your lab activities for today, is to install the software, the Genero Mobile 1.1 software, and configure the emulator for your lab activities. The theme for Genero Mobile, or the motto of Genero Mobile, is write once, deploy everywhere. So that means that I can write an application and I can use that same code set for a phone or a tablet. I can use the same set of code for iOS or Android. And we've got some screenshots here to show you that the look and feel for the app you develop is native for Android or iOS. So here's an example of Android screenshots just to show you that the same set of code, the same generated code, or the same custom written code can be used on a phone or a tablet, and it works either way. Now in this particular example, these Android screenshots, we do have something that I need to point out. Here's what the same app looks like on a phone. So we've got a list of customers, it looks like, over here on the left-hand side, this screenshot on the left. And then somebody has selected a customer and they've opened a grid form that you can see over here on the right. And so that's what it looks like, the same app on a phone. And then over here on the right-hand side, we've got a split view screenshot of what it looks like on a tablet. Now something to be aware of here is that split view is supported by Genero Mobile. We've got all kinds of information in the documentation on how to create a split view application or split view forms. But it will not automatically be generated in BAM. So that's something I need to make real clear here, is that split views are supported. You can custom code split view, but in BAM, when you generate the code for forms, it's going to look more what you see over here on the left, right, with these Android screenshots of the phone. You have two separate forms. And here again, we've got the same application, and it's just saying you can have the same app, you write it once and deploy it anywhere. And this is what it looks like over here on the left on an iOS device, an iPhone. And then over on the right, the two screenshots on the right are what the same app looks like running on Android. So iOS and Android look and feel. You don't have to write two sets of code. You don't have to do any customization to create sets of code for iOS versus Android. It's just built in to Genero Mobile, built into the product. There's two types of applications that are supported by Genero Mobile. Something called a standalone app and a partially connected app. So both of these types of applications are supported. You can see over here on the left that a standalone app just means that the application can run all by itself without any kind of a network connection. So it's a standalone application. No network connection needed, no connection needed to a back-end database server, for example. And the way that works is here we've got what we call the virtual machine. That's what the VM stands for that I have highlighted down at the bottom. That's our runtime environment for Genero Mobile, or Genero in general, for that matter. And so the runtime and the display client, that's what this GUI thread is talking about, are both installed on the mobile device. So it runs as a standalone application and does not require any kind of a network connection. No back-end server required. So we support that with Genero Mobile, and we also support something called a partially connected app that we see over here on the right. This example that we'll be using for all of our labs, and I'll be using as examples to show you this and that for the next 2 weeks, is called the Pool Doctors application. When you configure your lab environment, you'll actually have a copy of this Pool Doctors application, and it's a perfect example of what they're calling a partially connected app. Pool Doctors can run in a standalone mode. It can run without a network connection, but there's certain items in that application that require a network connection. Specifically, it does require synchronizing with a back-end database server. This Pool Doctors app, just a quick overview of it, is actually intended to be used by a technician out on a job site, and he gets information about new jobs that he's supposed to work on from a network connection, a back-end server. So he can certainly work on a job site. He can update information about the job, as we'll see a little bit later, in a standalone manner, but then when he needs to load new jobs, he needs that network connection. So a partially connected app means that there are certain things in the application that require a network connection, a connection to a server. Usually the case is for database, right? A back-end database server that has information that needs to be downloaded to the mobile device. So both of these types of applications are supported by Genero Mobile, and you'll be working with a partially connected app for the next 2 weeks. Another benefit of Genero Mobile is that you have access to native device features on mobile devices, but you don't have to have a lot of knowledge about the APIs, these native APIs. In BAM, that's even simpler because you don't even have to know certain function calls, or we call them front calls, that you would use if you were generating coding by hand. You would need to know something about these special front call functions we have out there to access device peripherals and various features on the devices, like email, contacts, phone, barcode readers, and so on. So if you code by hand, we have some fairly simple front calls that you can use to access these native device APIs or features. If you use BAM, you don't even have to know about the front calls or research the front calls. Instead, all you have to do is configure a few properties on these diagrams that we'll be introduced to today, and underneath the covers, BAM will go ahead and generate the code needed to access these device features. So this is just a list of all the different native device features that you have access with Genero Mobile. I mentioned web components earlier. Web components do require some custom code, but it gives you access to a lot of third-party graphical components that do some really nice things. The Pool Doctors app that we'll be using for the next couple of weeks for lab exercises makes use of web components for 2 or 3 things. One of them is this signature capture that you see a screenshot of here on the screen. In the case of Pool Doctors, when a technician has finished a job, he marks the job as complete, and it automatically asks for a signature, right? It uses this web component or invokes this embedded web component, and the customer is supposed to sign off on the job to show acknowledgement that the job's finished. So the Pool Doctors app uses the signature capture web component. It also uses a barcode scanner web component as well. So we'll see those web components. I'll introduce them to you. And in addition to that, we'll look at some web components for some other things. We've got a splash screen that's used with the Pool Doctors app that's actually another web component, and a browser type web component that you can use to display URL content. So we have about 4 different web components, or 4 different utilizations of web components to look at the next 2 weeks. So I think web components are a really nice feature to be able to embed these third-party components into your Genero apps. All right, so here we're switching gears from Genero Mobile. We had an introduction, a quick introduction of Genero Mobile. And of course, we'll be learning a lot more about Genero Mobile as we go through these 10 chapters. And here we're switching over to BAM. So an overview of the BAM component, or the BAM development tool. I already mentioned that BAM is short for Business Application Modeling. The whole idea with BAM is that instead of getting in there and coding by hand, you can actually design your application in a series of design diagrams that are simple and straightforward to use. And then after you're finished with your design, or even in the middle of working on a design, you can implement the design and generate the code for a particular form or program entity. It's very nice for testing and development because you can do it in increments. You can work on just a specific part of the application or a part of the application, and then you can add on additional parts of the application as you perfect each piece, or as you're happy with each piece. So there's less coding. In fact, the only coding that you need to do is the custom coding that you feel would improve the look and feel of the application, possibly to embed some of these web components that I mentioned on the previous page. That would require some custom coding, but it's not necessary for every application. It's just as you feel the need. So you can add the custom code if you feel the need or if it's necessary. There's less coding in general because we don't have to code anything to do with CRUD activities, or what they call CRUD activities. Create, read, update, and delete. So anything that has to do with updating a database, for example, is a great candidate for BAM. So very little custom coding or no custom coding required for applications that are performing database updates or maintenance. For BAM, you can also generate desktop web applications as well as mobile applications. It just so happens that we're focusing on the mobile applications in this class. And mentioned already that you can generate code to interact with all these different mobile device features: phone, SMS, mail, maps, and so on. and especially with BAM. You don't need to know a lot about the APIs under the covers because all it requires is working with the properties of some of these diagrams that you have in your BAM application. So here's a application development lifecycle diagram, and specifically we're looking at the pieces and parts of an application lifecycle that have to do with BAM here. So when you start out working with an application, hopefully you spend a lot of time on the specs, and of course working on specs involves determining exactly what you want that application to do. And that part really doesn't have anything to do with BAM. So that falls outside the BAM development lifecycle. The next stage is the application flow design. So what form or what interface will the user interact with first? And from there, depending on what kind of action the user invokes or triggers, where do we go from there? What form gets displayed next? So the actual flow design of the application does fall within BAM. We'll see that we have what we call the BA diagram, and that's where you can draw out or create your application flow design. So it is one of the diagrams in BAM. The same goes for the database design. When you're ready to configure or create the database, you can work with that from BAM as well. There's a special meta schema design. I just refer to that as the database diagram that you can use within BAM to configure the database, add tables, add columns, add primary keys, foreign keys, that type of thing. And then it even provides a way for you to create a script to go ahead and update the actual database under the covers. So we're working with a file, an XML file, called a meta schema for our database design that we're doing. But when we're happy with our meta schema, we can create a script and update the actual database, all from within this database diagram area. And we'll see a great deal more of that tomorrow or the next day. The implementation, of course, is a big part of BAM because that's where you go out and actually generate the code for the application that you have designed in your BA diagram and your database diagram. When you're finished with your implementation, we're saying that packaging falls outside of BAM, but actually BAM does provide tools to help you do the packaging. So a bit later, we'll talk about the way to create a new BAM mobile project. And if you create that BAM mobile project in the way that we're going to look, it will actually do a lot towards helping you package your application for deployment. Once you've got it packaged, you can deploy it, and you may be deploying it just to test it at first. And then, of course, later you'll want to distribute that application. So we'll talk some about different methods for distributing an application once you've packaged it and it's ready for deployment. So here we're looking at the BAM modeling diagrams, or we're talking about them at this point, but we will look at them. So it's based on several different diagrams. There's not just one diagram for BAM, there's actually several of them. And each individual diagram has its own special purpose. We've talked about two of them already. We've got this business application diagram, or the BA diagram, where we actually do all the modeling for the application flow. So that's how we design our application flow. And we also have talked a bit about the database diagram. And notice here they're using the official name for it, Meta Schema Manager Diagram. That's a mouthful, so I usually just refer to that as the database diagram. So the BA diagram and the database diagram, the Meta Schema Manager Diagram, are two of these diagrams, and it's pretty clear that those have two separate purposes. We also have a special diagram called the Form Designer diagram that you can use to work with the user interface, the forms that make up your user interface. So we have Form Designer that you can use to model the application's forms, and built into Form Designer is also a special tab called a Records tab that you can use to work with business record diagrams. That's number 4 on your list. So the business record diagrams model the data definition, the structure, the table relationships of the data in the form. So think of the business record, if you're familiar with Genero BDL, the business record is what essentially makes up your screen record, right? All the fields that are displayed in the form are part of the business record diagram. So there's 4 different diagrams, and we'll be working with those extensively for the next couple of weeks. So here's what the business application diagram looks like, the BA diagram. We'll just call it that for short. So the BA diagram, you can see, is a modeling diagram that you can use to model the flow of your application. And you can see here they've got some entities pointed out. We have program entities. Grab a highlighter here. We have program entities. You see one up here. And then all the rest of these entities down here on these next 2 levels are form entities. And then down here you see some special device entities that allow you to interact with the mobile device features that we've talked about earlier. And in between the entities, these are relations. All these arrows that are pointing from one entity to another entity are relations. There are properties associated with all these different entities and also the relations between the entities. And these properties are what you configure and tweak to get the behavior that you want from your application. So there's a tremendous amount of tweaking and behavior changing that you can do by tinkering with the properties on the form entities. That's what this is up here with the big entity arrow pointing to it. The records, which we can't see here, we need the actual business record diagrams for that, and the relations. All of them have properties associated with them, and those properties affect the behavior of the application. You can see even from this one screenshot some of the properties over here on the right-hand side. For example, you can define the open mode here. Do you want the form to open up in display mode, or do you want it to open up in modify mode so that the user can go ahead and open the form and start modifying it without having to pick any other option? So that's an example of some of the many properties that you can configure and change to change the app behavior. So some more about the Metaschema Manager diagram, and this is what the Metaschema Manager diagram looks like, and I'll give you a better view of these close up with the Pool Doctors application here in a little while. But the Metaschema Manager diagram is the one I just call the database diagram, and a metaschema is a requirement for Genero. The metaschema is not the same thing as the actual database. The metaschema is an XML file that has all the information in it about the database tables, keys, constraints, and it also has information about a lot more things than we actually keep in the actual database. Things like labels that you want to use in a form can actually be kept inside the Metaschema Manager. So that helps create new forms. You don't have to go in and try to remember exactly what labels you've used in a form that use the same field because it's already built into the Metaschema. So the Metaschema is an XML file that has basically a description of your database and all of its components, and we use this Metaschema for a lot of different things while we're in development. The Metaschema is not used once you execute the application. When you actually run the application, it doesn't use the Metaschema. It actually connects to the actual database. But the Metaschema is used to, like in this screenshot we see right here, we're not looking at the actual database, we're looking at the Metaschema in this screenshot. So we use the Metaschema to look at the structure of our tables, columns, keys, and so on, constraints. When we get ready to create a form, it doesn't go out to the actual database to get information about the fields in the database. It's actually just looking at the meta schema, and you can select the fields, and you're actually picking them from the meta schema when you create a form. So it's a time saver, and it also has a lot of enhancements to it that you don't have built into the actual database. And it's used for compiling. Anytime, for example, you define a variable like a database column, it's not using the database for that, it's checking with the schema, right, the meta schema that we have to make sure it's a certain data type, a certain size, and so on, or to get that information. So that's the meta schema manager diagram. It's based on an XML file that has a description of all the database pieces and parts in it, tables, columns, constraints, keys, and we use that during the development process instead of actually using the database. The form designer diagram is used to actually create the user interface. These forms are what makes up the user interface that the user sees when he's in the application. So there's two types of generated forms. There's CRUD forms, which I described a second ago what a CRUD form is. That's your create, read, update, and delete activity. So CRUD forms are used for interacting with a database, right, to update, add new information to your database tables. And then we've also got Zoom forms, which are a convenience for your user to allow them to select a value for an underlying column or field from a list. So there's a lot of things like, let's say, a list of products, for example. He may not know the name of a specific product right off the top of his head, but in a Zoom form he can just scan the list and pick a specific product from the list without having to remember exactly how to spell it or the exact full name. So Zoom forms are the second type of generated forms. You'll be using both types of forms the next 2 weeks in your application, so you'll learn how to design and implement and change the behavior of CRUD forms and Zoom forms. The business record diagram I mentioned earlier is used to define the screen record for your application. So if you're familiar with that terminology, that gives you a good idea of what the business record does. If you're not familiar with it, you can still get a good idea of what it does right here. It records the information about the structures of the table that are going to be displayed in the form, all the columns that are going to be displayed in the form. It has the structural information there that's used to create your select statements or be able to filter data. Is all built into this record. So in your application, when we're working with the database, it's using fields and information from these record diagrams, essentially all the fields that make up the form. This next section is talking about code generation and what's happening underneath the covers when you use BAM, the application modeler. The code generation tool, or BAM, underneath the covers uses a standard template. In version 1.0, DDApp 3.1, or 3.1, was the default template and the recommended template for Genero Mobile 1.0. The latest and greatest version of Genero Mobile is 1.1, and with 1.1 we've upgraded the template to 3.2. So 3.2 is the default and recommended template for the latest version of Genero Mobile. All a template is just a bunch of files that are used to create this generated code. And you can see a list here with the screenshot. We'll actually explore a lot of these template files in a later lab exercise. We'll talk about them in the lecture, and then we'll go in and actually look at them in detail in the lab exercise. So later on this week or next week, you'll have a much better idea of the template set and the files that are used with the template set and exactly what they do. One of the reasons that we're going to look at them in some detail is that you can actually go out and customize or create your own template set if you want to, your own set of files. We have a section in our documentation on being a template developer. So you can actually go out and create your own template set or customize our template set to meet your needs. So we'll learn a bit more about the template sets to give you a head start on that in case you ever want to do that. I think for most of it, it's unlikely that we need to get down to that level, but it's always nice to know that some sort of feature is available. So how code is generated? We have something called build rules that are used to determine the code generation process. It just follows a series of rules that are created in a file. Now these build rules are different based on the type of entity that you're generating the code for, and they're customizable. So you can actually go in and change the build rules if you feel the need. And again, kind of like the template files, the template set, it's unlikely for most of us that we need to go in and edit these build rules that determine the order and where everything goes and what's looked at first. But again, it's nice to know they're there in case you ever do have the need. So the way a build is performed, this is our set of steps, is the first thing it really does is creates an XML file. It doesn't say that over on the left, but you can see it here in the diagram. This XML file has all the information in it for a specific entity, and that includes information from the meta schema about that specific, the tables, columns, indexes, keys, and whatnot that underlie that specific table. It has information in there about the entity and all the properties that you've defined in the entity. So all the things that come from the BA diagram, that entity in the BA diagram. So all those properties and all the schema information for that entity are in this XML file that gets generated. So it generates this XML file with all the information it needs to generate the code for a specific, let's say, form entity. And then the next thing it does is it looks for any customized code. And if there's any customized code, it takes that out. So if you've gone in and added some information, to add or embed a web component, for example, that gets extracted during the build, and it gets saved off into a special file. And then it's ready to go ahead and start building the app without the custom code. So it generates some files, and we'll take a look at those files here briefly in this chapter, but in more detail later. And then it goes ahead and loads back in the custom code from this saved file, compiles it, and then does the linking. So it's a fairly straightforward process, and you can see all these rules that govern the process for a specific project and then for each specific type of entity if you want to. I'll have you do that in your lab exercises just for the experience, but you won't need to change them. So here's what a build rule looks like, and the one we've selected here is the one to build the program entity, right? The actual program entity that contains the main for the program. So here it's circled 4PRG. That's your extension for your BAM generated program entities. And then here's all the different steps that are part of the rule. So this whole thing is a rule. And you can see here that we've specifically looked at this type of entity. And then here's some command lines. And notice you can edit these if you like. I wouldn't recommend it unless you really need to. But here's the step-by-steps. So this generate -depth -L -BA, that's the part that I mentioned creates an XML file. And it's kind of a temporary XML file or intermediary file that has the description of the entity from all the properties that are in the BA diagram for that entity. And it also has information in there from the meta schema that affect the tables and columns that are in that form entity. So here's creating the XML file. This part right here is the part that actually extracts the custom code and stores it in a, you can even see just right here at the edge, it creates a .code extension on the file for that specific entity. So that if you see those .code files out in your directory structure, that's what's there. That's your custom code that you might have added while you're working on your application. This is a TCL executable, TCL or TCL that's used. One of the things we'll talk about shortly is that the code generator actually uses TCL, a scripting, kind of an open source scripting language, is part of the way that code is generated. And we'll see that in more detail later on. And then here's going back in and putting that custom code back in, compiling, and linking. So those are the build rules. You can see the build rules. The best way to do it is to go in, and when you have a project and you have an application in your project, you can right-click on that application, and there's an option there to edit build rules. Again, we'll see that in a lab. I have you go out and look at them briefly, but of course I don't have you actually change them. There's not usually a need to do that. So understanding what gets generated, and I think this would be a good place to pop on over and just show you some of this. So here is a BA diagram. This area that's already selected up here, or should be displaying in your screen, is the BA diagram for the Pool Doctors application. And you can see all the different entities here. There's always one program entity here. And then here's the first form that a user would see when they launch that application. In this case, it's job header list, and then depending on the action that the user selects or the option that the user selects in this form, that determines what he sees next. Either this job header, well, in this case, there's only one place to go, the job header grid form, and then depending on what he selects in the grid form, he can go off in different directions. To look at customer information, details about the job parts or components, which is what this job detail list has in it. We'll see more of that later. He can go out and look at pictures of the job site or take pictures of the job site. He can add timesheet entries. He can add notes or look at notes, just depending on the option he selects from this job header grid form. So just to give you an idea of the flow, how you can look at a BA diagram and tell a bit about the flow just by looking at the diagram itself. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So over here on the left-hand side, I've got my what they call the projects view. So this is my project area here. We'll talk more about that shortly. But the main purpose for us being in here right now is so that I can show you these generated files. So I'm going to focus on that. We'll pick this one here, the customer grid form. And so for all the form entities, this job header list form, the job header grid, job photo list, any entity out here that's a form entity, I'm going to see this same list of files. Now, of course, the name will be different, right? The job photo list won't be called customer grid, but it will have an underscore UI data, an underscore UI dialog data, and so on. So that's one of the things that's very nice about generating your application code, is that the code that gets generated is very predictable and standardized. Let's open another one here. We'll just get this one right below it. Here's the job detail. And notice if you look at the files that are generated for the job detail, now there's two different forms that are kept in this particular folder. So I'm seeing all these generated files for this grid form, job detail grid, and then they're also keeping the list form information here too, all the files related to that entity. So, but notice that each entity, each form, has a set of these same generated files. Only the names are different, and of course the actual functionality can be different depending on the properties that you've set to customize or tweak it. So just a quick view. We'll take a much better look as we go along. We talked about the form diagram. So here's what the form designer component of Genero Studio looks like, and this is your form design. Here's the record diagram here. Drag this out a bit so you can see it better. So it has all the different fields that are displayed in the form. Now this one has some additional fields that are not part of the database, and this will all be explained somewhat later when we start talking about implementing these forms and some of the tweaking and tuning that you can do to make them better. All right, just so I don't ruin what's coming up by showing you too far ahead, let's pop back into the PowerPoint slide. And those are some of the files that we talked about. Now notice that here we have circled the program entity intermediate files folder that shows you all of the generated files for the program entity. Notice it's different. There's not as many files generated for program entities as there are for these form entities. So that's perfectly okay and normal. So form entities do have, I didn't count them, but maybe a half a dozen files generated for them. They're very standardized, but the program entities only have a few. I mentioned earlier that BAM is a component of Genero Studio, so that's what we're seeing here, is that there are a lot of different components of Genero Studio to make the development process easier. So Business Application Modeler is considered one of those components. It comes with Genero Studio, and Genero Studio comes with Genero Mobile. So when you get Genero Mobile, you get Genero Studio with it and all of these different development components. This is part of the IDE that we're talking about. So BAM is one of the components, but we also have a code editor component. It's a very simple but very intelligent code editor. I'm very happy with our code editor. It gives me all kinds of hints when I've made an error or have a typo. I immediately see that in our code editor. I'll see warnings and errors in the gutter of the editor if I'm making mistakes. So I get a heads up right away. I don't have to wait till I try to build the application or compile a file. So it's a very intelligent editor. There's the form designer component that actually is the source of your form diagram that we looked at a minute ago. That's really form designer that you're using to model your forms, or to enhance your forms, not model them, but enhance them. We have the project view, or project manager, that you can use to manage your projects. I'll show you the graphical debugger some this week. I use it quite a bit. If I'm looking for something in an application and I don't want to spend a lot of time doing it, a lot of times I'll just pop into the graphical debugger and use that, run the app, the debugger will run the app, and when I get to the certain point where I want to see the code, there's an interrupt option. And I'll hit this interrupt option in the graphical debugger, and it'll put me right there in the code where the application is currently at, right, where I'm at in the code. So I use the graphical debugger a lot, not just to debug errors, but also to explore an application and quickly find some code that I want to see or need to see. We also have components that have to do with web services. With Genero Studio, we have some version control software, SCM, that's integrated into Genero Studio. We have a profiler tool that you can use to see what parts of your application are causing you the most overhead, right? Where is my application spending all of its time? You can use the profiler to do that, to see where you might have some bottlenecks, for example. We have the meta schema, which we've been talking about. That's our database design diagram that we've been talking about. There's also a diff tool that you can use to look at the differences between a source file that you've been working on for a while and see what the differences are between it and the base source file, the one you started with, or another one sitting out there on disk if you prefer. So that's a quick way to see changes to a source file that might be causing it to fail. And you can even revert those changes if you like using this diff tool. So it helps you put everything back to the way it was if you want it to, and you can do that on a change-by-change basis. So a very powerful tool. So a lot of components. This is our Genero Studio IDE and all the components, and BAM is one of those components. So here is where I'm supposed to give you a tour. I got a bit ahead of myself earlier and showed you some of the BAM diagrams and a bit about the Pool Doctors app, but this is probably a good place to do it. So we're going to take a look at the BAM diagrams in more detail, some projects view, and code editor here. So I'll pop this back up. So I think the best thing to do would be just to start out with a quick introduction to the Pool Doctors app. I think this is coming up later as well, but I think we can do it now without hurting anything. This will also be a way for you to be introduced to the emulator. All right, so here's my emulator. This is what you'll be doing in your lab this afternoon or in the morning, whenever you choose to do the lab. This is the Pool Doctors app that I've been talking about. This is the splash screen, and this is an embedded web component. We'll actually learn how to use this web component to create a splash screen. I think on Friday, Thursday or Friday, and that's next week. Not this week, but next week. We'll see exactly how this web component has been integrated with the Pool Doctors app. So here's the splash screen. Now, if you are a technician out on a job, one of the first things you would do when you get ready for your day would be to use this sync option here. So if I click sync, this option is what actually downloads any new jobs. Now I just ran the sync already, and I'm not actually using it as a real technician, so I didn't have any new jobs. So there were 0 new jobs loaded, but it also refreshed product records, customer records, and if I, as a technician, completed any jobs, this sync routine also sends that completed job information back to the back-end server. Now that all has to do with the synchronization routine, and that's one of our advanced topics that we'll talk about, if I remember, in Chapter 9. So Thursday or Friday of next week, we'll take a look at this synchronization routine and see how that's been implemented. So if I was a technician, that would be the way I would start out, right, with this Pool Doctors application. I would want to pull down to my mobile device any new jobs that had been entered at the headquarters. So the process would be that a customer calls the headquarters and talks to somebody there. They enter information about the job and assign it to a particular technician. And then the technician is responsible for synchronizing so that he can see his new jobs on his mobile device. So that's what we just did by running that sync routine. Now once I have my jobs downloaded for the day, I can go in and look at my list of jobs. So let me just move this over so we can see where we're at here. Kind of hard to do. Scooch this over to the left, bring the emulator back up. So here we are, just to give you a thorough tour. We're in this job header list form right now. So that's what we see here in the emulator, is this entity here. If I pick a particular job, by picking that, now it's displaying this job header grid form. Every time I click on an entity in the BA diagram, of course, it's going to minimize my emulator, so bear with me there. So now we're in this job header grid form. So isn't the BA diagram easy to read, right? You can see exactly the flow of the program and, of course, design the flow of your program right here in this BA diagram. You don't have to know a lot about the customizations that you want to do or the properties that you want to set to get started. Once you have your specs for the application complete, you can get in here and start working. If you're not happy with something, you can delete it and start over. Change the properties for an entity until you're happy with the behavior. So here's the job header grid form. I can see what that looks like to the user over here in my, whoops, I waited too long, didn't I? There we go. See what it looks like to the user. And this is all just using the emulator in my development environment. I can pick a customer here. I'm pretending that I'm a technician, so I can pick a customer. I can navigate to the customer location with this map button here. Now, one thing that I probably need to tell you here is that when you're working with an emulator, the functionality of this particular device entity feature is not going to work because we're working inside the emulator. Now, it is possible to configure it to allow mock locations, and it can get some functionality, but it's lots of steps, and those steps are outside of the scope of this class. However, we do have instructions for doing that if you would like to do it in our documentation, the Genero Mobile documentation. But for the emulator's purpose, it's enough to see that we can at least get some functionality by triggering that, and it's going off to do to interact with the device API. So in real life, when this is deployed, I can use that map to locate my customer. I can use the phone device entity here. Let me just show you too where these are mapped. So right now in the emulator, we're right here in the customer grid. Pull it back up here. So this is the customer grid form, and I've got all these options. I can look up the customer on a map, and that's because of this maps entity that's been diagrammed here, and the properties have been set for that. I can call the customer because of this phone entity. I can text the customer here with this SMS entity, device entity, and then way down at the bottom, it's hard for me to pull it up high enough, I've got email. So if I want to email the customer, I have integrated in this form email device entity. So that's what we're seeing there, all these entities that have been diagrammed up here at the top. So let's back out of the customer stuff so I can go look at customer information. I can also, and I should have mentioned this earlier, one of the first things I need to do as a technician would be to get in here and start a job. And by starting a job, notice this one's already started. I click on the Start button, and that gives me access to all of these other entities, all of this other code. I can go in and add parts. So if a job requires a specific part to be completed, I can go in here and specify the part. Here I'm just looking at parts, and just to kind of go back here and show you where we're at, I went back to here to the job header grid entity, and then I went up here to this job detail list entity. Stretch that out a bit. There we go. Pull the emulator back out. Let me go back. There we go. So right here, it's kind of hard to find a place to go. We're in this job detail grid form is what we're looking at here on the emulator. And if I want to pick a product for this job or change a product for this job, or if I'm adding a new job, right, there's options to add. Well, it's in the other form, sorry. But let me back out. Got myself in a circle here. All right, so here we are going into the job details. If I want to edit it, I can go here and click. That's actually a button edit, and this button edit we'll learn all about brings up another type of form called a zoom form. And over here on our grid, or excuse me, on our BA diagram, here's the zoom form. So this entity right here that says product list and has a picture of a magnifying glass on it represents a zoom form entity. That's our second type of form. We'll be talking about all these different types of entities and what zoom forms are in more detail, of course, as we go along. So think of this as just a quick overview on how this BA diagram corresponds with what the user sees, right? It can all ties it together, I think, to be able to see that I can follow the flow of the program here in the BA diagram, and I can see that here in the actual running application. All right, so let me back out of there. I don't really want to pick another product. So we'll go ahead and back all the way out of there. Now something else I can do is I can go in and look at photos. There's not any photos here, but I can go in and take photos. The emulator's better about showing us the photo device functionality. So you get a better idea of what's going on there, that it's working. I can also go in and look at notes or add notes about a job. And I can also add timesheet entries. For the labs that you do this week, one of the biggest things that you'll be doing this week is actually implementing this notes functionality. When you download the base lab this afternoon, you'll have part of the Pool Doctors application, but you won't have it all. Specifically, you will not have that zoom form that we saw a moment ago to be able to go out and pick a product from a list. You'll have to actually diagram that and configure that as part of your lab steps this week. The same thing goes for notes. You won't actually have any of this, what we see here about notes. You'll actually be diagramming your notes entities. There'll be two different forms that you're going to diagram, and then you're going to customize the behavior of those entities by working with the form properties and the relation properties. So that's actually going to be part of your labs this week. Now finally, when a technician finishes a job, he clicks this complete button. I'm not going to click that because I'm going to be showing you this job number 17 several times, but I'll do it right here. I'll pick this job, and when I finish a job, I click complete. And notice when I click complete, that's what causes this web component to be invoked, and it does the signature capture. So this is where I would type in my name, and then I can actually, I'll just type in a bit of it, and then this is where I can actually do my signature. So that's a quick tour. I'm going to back out of that. Oops, I didn't mean to cancel. I meant to say no. Go away. So that's a quick tour of the Pool Doctors application and the functionality of the Pool Doctors application, just to get you familiar with it so that you'll know if it's working right whenever you install your project or download your project this afternoon. So here's the BA diagram that we've been talking about. Here's the whole thing up here on the screen that you can see. A bit more about the projects view over here on the left. I'm going to go ahead and kill that application over here. By the way, this stop button here in the toolbar, you can use that to abort an application when you're testing it. Let's see. I think what I'll do here is just go ahead and close this for a minute. And show you the File New option that you can use to create a new BAM mobile project. I don't want to get into this in too much detail because this is one of the topics that we talk about tomorrow. But to create that project, we went out to this File New, and right here in File New, under the Design category, there's a BAM mobile project option that creates a BAM project. And tomorrow we'll talk about the benefits to using this type of project for BAM, because it does go out and create a lot of default structures that make working with a mobile application easier and packaging that application a lot easier. So that'll be a topic I'll save off for tomorrow. To open a project, you can just double-click it. If you've got projects already out there on disk, which will be the case with your Pool Doctors application, you can double-click it, or you have this option where you right-click and there's an option to open with Genero Mobile 1.1. So there's Genero Mobile launching. It popped up in my other monitor there, and there it comes up. And notice that it saves it just as it was when I was working on it. So any source files or diagrams that I have open will be open again when I launch that project again, or when I open that project again. One thing I haven't shown you, I'm trying to think if I've shown you everything or haven't shown you everything, is Code Editor. So let me just pick a file here to show you Code Editor. Now open up a source file. You can just double click on a file to open up Code Editor. And this is Code Editor. So this is the actual generated code for the job note grid form, or some of the generated code. Remember that there's several files that are generated for each entity. And this is BDL, the Genero Business Development Language. So these are BDL statements, BDL code out here. And I like the code editor because it's very good about showing you if you've made any mistakes. Notice I get an error right away in the gutter there if I make any mistakes. Also notice that it color codes lines. Like notice the green plus sign here tells me that this is a new line that's been added since the last time I've worked on this particular source file. So I like the instant results I get with Code Editor. Now something else, let me show you real quick, is this copy to write. So the copy to write is a built-in diff, actually. That diff feature that we talked about when we were looking at all the different Genero Studio components. One of the features is it's built into Code Editor so that in this case the base source file that I opened up and started working on, it sees now that there's a difference. So I'm getting either the green, which means that I've added a new line to the file or new lines. If it's yellow or orange, I guess this is more orange, isn't it? If it's orange, that means I've modified a line since I started. And I can come back in here and there's a copy to write, which will revert out of any errors or changes. And I can do that per change. It's not everything I've done since I entered this source file. It can be a specific change. So that's a nifty feature for Code Editor. But this is Code Editor. You can see you just start typing as you go along. It's also good about automatically changing the case for keywords. That's what's been happening here with these uppercase keywords. It'll do that automatically for you. It also handles indentions automatically for you. And again, you saw that it catches errors right away. It's a very intelligent editor. Okay. Well, that probably is good for the first module. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything, and it looks like we are at the end. So our learning objectives for this module are to install and license the Genero Mobile software, understand development mode configuration options, whether or not you can use a physical device or an emulator, and what your options are between iOS and Android. Configure the Genero Mobile environment for developing and running apps. Configure and use an emulator effectively, since that's what we'll be using for our labs in this class, at least officially. Compile, run, and interact with an app. I believe I'm supposed to do an instructor demo for that part, so I've already got that part out of the way. You had to sit through all of that in the last chapter. So we may end up being a bit shorter that way. So this first topic is installing and licensing the Genero Mobile software. So we're starting out here with a table of information about the Genero Mobile packages. So we have packages, Genero Mobile, for Windows, Mac, OS, and Linux. So over here on the left, grab my highlighter so I can point things out to you. On our left, we have our development platform, and you can see we have Mac up here at the top. We have the supported Linux development platforms, and then we have our Windows supported platforms down here at the bottom. And then over here on the right-hand side, we've got our target platforms. Here's our Android specifics, and then here are our iOS specifics. So we support Android 4 to 4.4, iOS 7, and 8.1. So here we're saying if we have Mac OS for our development platform, then we can develop and build a package for Android. So you can develop with Mac, you can build the package with Mac for Android. And the same thing is true for Linux and Microsoft Windows. So that's kind of how to read this table of information. The big difference, or the part that you should be aware of, is over here when we're talking about iOS. Now notice for iOS, you can develop iOS applications that will run for iOS, but if you're using Linux or Windows, you won't be able to package the application. You won't be able to do the packaging unless you have Mac. So at the point where you're ready to create the package or run the application even on a physical device, you will need a Mac. So certain things you can do with any of the platforms, but when it comes to iOS, it's a little pickier, and with iOS you do need a Mac to be able to run the application on a physical device versus an emulator, and you need a Mac to be able to build the package, to create the package. But all the development, you can use Windows or Linux for the development. You just can't build the package. Something I guess I can mention on this page just as well, so we won't go back, we'll just keep going. So here we're showing you the GeneroMobile.com site, where you can get the free version of Genero Mobile, or you can buy Genero Mobile from the website, depending on what your requirements are. So you're selecting a license option here, and notice that the freebie version, which is all you need for class the next 2 weeks, has some limitations on it. So it's good to be aware of the limitations. So right here, if you get the free version, platform supported, one developer, and here's the big limitation, because so far all of that is common to all the different licensing options. The part that is important here is that if you have the free version, your P code, your generated code, is limited to 64K for Genero Mobile, the personal free version. And for the other versions of the bundle, it's unlimited. So that's one big difference between getting the free version and then the paid versions of the software. For all three versions, you'll still need a license key. You'll need to install a license key. What you're actually licensing is Genero BDL when you do the licensing, but there is a specific version of the license for Genero Mobile. So if you've already got Genero in your work environment and you're trying to use a license key that you've used with just standard Genero, not Genero Mobile, you'll get an error. So just be aware that you do need a separate key for Genero Mobile than just standard Genero. When you fill out, one of the things you'll have to do to be able to download the software is you'll have to fill out a registration form, and you'll have to give it your email address. When you give it that email address and your registration is processed right there online while you're working, it will send you an email with your license key in the email. So you will get a license key for all three versions, and the installation process will require you to put that license key in. So you do have to register, give it an email, and that's how you will get your license key. And then during the installation process, you'll be required to use that license key at the end. And then at that point, after you've registered, you can pick your bundle that you want to download or purchase and download. And then once you've downloaded, of course, you're going to execute the package executable and then walk through a wizard to do the installation and the licensing. And notice the other big difference between the personal free version and the different purchase options. The P-code size, which I've already mentioned, but also a difference on the support you get with the different types of bundles. If you have the freebie version, the support you have is limited to the forums, what they're calling community support. If you purchase one of the bundles, if you use the business option, you also get the email support. So you get the forums plus the email support. If you get the Business Plus license, then you have the forums, the email support, and you also get chat and a service level agreement of 1 business day for down systems, like down production systems. So there's the two big differences, the size of the application that you can create with the freebie version and the support that you get with the free version differ from the two licensed options, the two purchase license options. And as you can see, Business Plus has better support options than the business license. So here we're talking about development mode configuration options. So Genero Mobile for Android is our client that gets installed on your physical device if you're using a physical device, or your emulator. They're calling it a virtual device here. So that's Genero Mobile for Android, and it does have some requirements. So we've got the requirements here. If you do your lab this afternoon, the lab will actually walk you through step by step on configuring these requirements and installing these requirements. You are required to have the Java Software Developer Kit, the Android SDK for your Android development. And for Android, you'll also need an internet connection. For the first time you build your package, your application package for Android, it requires something called Gradle, which is a project automation tool that it uses for the packaging, specifically for Java extensions and that type of thing. So you will need that initial internet connection the first time you do a build, and then after that you should not. You'll have Gradle downloaded at that point. And then you have to decide whether you want to use an Android emulator or an Android physical device with a USB connection to your development machine. So there's your two options for your development environment if you're working with Android. So again, of course, in our case, since we can't depend on everybody having an Android tablet or an Android phone, we're going to be using an emulator for all the lab activities. So for iOS, here's the requirements. You can use Xcode 5 or Xcode 6. You do have to have Genero Mobile 1.1 to be able to use Xcode 6, but we recommend that you have 1.1 and Xcode 6. For one thing, you get more options on emulators that you want to use with Xcode 6, and Xcode 5 has additional restrictions that make it not as much of a pleasure to work with as Xcode 6. So for Xcode 6, which is what we recommend, you need a Mac running a minimum, grab my highlighter here, of Mac OS X 10.9.3. There's the requirements for Xcode 5. And then you will also need, and this is not just for Xcode 5, this is just in general, you'll need a standard free Apple ID account or a purchased developer account. And you'll need that before you can deploy your application, right? To be able to deploy or even deploy it to your own physical device, you will need that free Apple ID account, or you can use the Purchase Developer account if you prefer. For class purposes, if you decided to use an iOS device or iPhone device for class, we'd be perfectly fine with you just using the free Apple ID account. But in any case, the labs are all written based on the Android emulator. So either an iOS simulator, which is included with Xcode 5, and you have options, more options with Xcode 6. So you can use a simulator, or if you have an iPhone, which is what I use for my testing on iOS, you can just use your iPhone or iPad, your iOS tablet, whatever you happen to have connected with USB. Here's more about the Genero Mobile Development Client that you can use with iOS development. This is what allows you to work with iOS regardless of what development platform you have to work with. So if you don't have a Mac, you can still do development for iOS if you use this Genero Mobile Development Client. That's exactly what it's for. So this lets you do the development for iOS apps on Windows or Linux. You don't have to have a Mac. But again, to be able to package and deploy the app, you will have to use a Mac. So this gets you through the development process without having to use a Mac. So to get this Genero Mobile Development Client that you can use for iOS development, you can download it from the Apple App Store. We have it there. And you can install it on your mobile device. You would just get into the App Store and do a search for Genero Mobile Development Client. Put in the full name, and it should be able to find it pretty easily. So to configure and use the emulator effectively, and this is specifically designed for your lab environment. The reason we're covering this in more detail here instead of referring you to the documentation is because this is what we'll be using for your lab environment this week. So we're giving you information that otherwise would just kind of point you to the documentation for. But in the lab, when you do the lab this afternoon, it will have step-by-step instructions for each one of these slides that we're looking at here. So it will actually be easier yet in the lab. So Genero configuration for an Android virtual device, which is what we'll be using for labs. So there is this provided configuration with Genero Mobile just for the Android emulator or Android virtual device. Now there are certain physical devices, Android physical devices, that would also use this x86 configuration, but for the most part it's just for the emulator. So here they're showing you how to select the proper Genero configuration. Grab my highlighter. And it's this one here for x86. So you want to make sure you have that selected down here in the bottom corner. There's a little drop down, and that's where you would go in and pick the configuration you are wanting to work with. For the most part, you can assume that the x86 is for working with the emulator or work with an emulator, and then this Android ARM is typically for working with the Android physical devices. So we noticed earlier, or commented earlier, that one of the configuration requirements for working with Android is installing and configuring Java. So this is where we're talking about installing Java Standard Edition. It needs to be the Java Development Kit 7 or greater is what we support. And once you get it installed, you also need to set your environment variable, this JDK home environment variable, in your configuration, your Android x86 configuration that you selected on the previous page that we talked about. So right here, you would go into that configuration. Up here is an environment set panel right here. And then in your environment set, you would look for this Java SDK environment set. And then the environment variable that you're looking for is this JDK home. So you need to find that after you've installed your Java. Make sure when you do the install that you make a note of your installation directory, for Java, and then you're going to specify that installation directory right here. So mine is C program files Java JDK 1.8.0, and yours may not be exactly like that. The main thing here is just to make sure you specify your installation directory under this JDK home environment variable. Make sure that's correct. You also need the Android SDK, which makes sense if we're working on applications that are going to run on Android. You need the Android SDK. We've included the link here so that you can easily find the SDK, and that's in your lab instructions as well. And then once you've installed the Android SDK per the lab instructions, you need to do a similar thing, just like you did with the Java, for the Android SDK. You've got another environment set that you need to configure. So here again, we're still in this x86 configuration. And this time, instead of Java SDK, we've selected this Android environment set. And then Android home is the environment variable that we want to select and make sure we put our installation path here. So notice there's a note: don't install the Android SDK to the program files directory, because then you would have to run your configuration as administrator for that initial SDK config that we'll see here in just a minute. So that would be problematic or a nuisance, so we just recommend that you put it somewhere else. So on my machine, I put it on the D drive, Android, and then Android-SDK. And again, your installation directory can be different. Just try to avoid the program files directory. Now once you've got your Java installation done and your Android SDK installation done and your environment variables set in your configuration, then you can go about actually configuring your Android emulator. So happily, there's some nifty tools under Tools, Android Tools in Genero Mobile that you can use to make that process very simple. So one of the first steps is this auto configure the Android SDK. So that will actually bring up a separate console window, so watch for that. If you have a bunch of stuff up on the screen, that should pop up on top. And I think there's like one prompt that you'll have to answer to install or auto configure the SDK. Now that can take a while, because one of the things it'll do is go out and look for updates for the SDK. And if it finds them, which it probably will find some, it will go ahead and download those for you. So that can take a while to do that auto configure step. You will get some prompts, but again, you can just use the defaults to answer the prompts. So there's the auto configure option. Notice you also have options to create a virtual device, an emulator that you can use. You'll be using that option. Launch the emulator, and then deploy the client, Genero Mobile for Android, to your emulator once you have it launched. So we've got special pages for most of that so that you can see what that looks like. I almost missed a step, so let me go back for just a second. So after you do your auto configure on the Android SDK, this option right here, this is one I mentioned might take a while. It's downloading and installing updates. You need to create your virtual device with this option. And then once you create your virtual device, we want you to install something called Hexum. So that's what this screenshot is all about. When you download the Android SDK, it's going to come with this hardware accelerated execution manager that you can use to really improve the performance on your Android emulator. For a while in 1.0 we said that that was optional, but through discoveries between 1.0 and 1.1 they've decided it's just too problematical to use the emulator without having this Hexum, hardware accelerated execution manager. So now we've actually made that a requirement. So after you have created your emulator with that first step in your lab, the next step will have you install this Hexum. It's a pretty straightforward process. The executable will be there from installing your Android SDK. Then once you've launched your emulator, that would be the next step after installing Hexum, you're ready to deploy this Genero Mobile client. So one of the things you'll need to check is to make sure you're allowing installation from unknown sources on the device, even the virtual device. That's under Settings, Security, and you just make sure that there's little check marks next to the unknown sources is selected. And then you're ready to deploy Genero Mobile for Android. You can see that once you've deployed it, you should get this standard Genero Mobile icon that you've seen all the way through this course, because we have it in every corner of every slide. So that's what it looks like once you have it deployed. Now once you've got that client deployed, then of course you can use your emulator to display or view your running apps. So that's what this part's about. And I don't even have to do this instructor demo because I've already done it in the last chapter. So you'll be spared seeing that again. So we managed to get through that chapter quite a bit quicker than we did the first module. So I'm going to stop here and just see if there's any other questions. The only thing that we still need to do before I let you go for the day is to take a look at the lab that you'll be working on. So let me grab the lab and pop it up here. All right, so we've called this Lab 2, even though it's the first lab you're working on, just so that it will correspond with the modules. It gets confusing if you have Lab 1, but you're working on Module 2 in the class. So we've just kind of tied the names of these labs to the module that they're associated with. So you'll be starting out with Lab 2, and you can see here the first exercise is just to install the Genero Mobile 1.1 bundle. So again, if you already have Genero Mobile 1.1 on your development system, you can skip this part. Otherwise, this tells you step by step how to navigate to the site, pick the freebie option and download it. The license info, remember, will be in an email that it sends you when you finish the registration process. And then it's just telling you to go ahead and execute the package executable and follow the wizard. So that's the first exercise, is just downloading and installing the Genero Mobile package. And then exercise 2 will be configure Genero Mobile for Android. So that's the steps that we just went through. Going to install Java, the Java Standard Edition software, whatever's suitable for the version of the operating system you're using will be fine, but we do have a minimum of version 7. So version 7 or later. And here's the path, or the URL, to be able to download the software. And then here's where you're going out and updating that Java SDK environment set that we saw in the PowerPoint slides a few minutes ago. And you're going to set your environment variable for this JDK home environment variable. So make sure when you install your Java SDK that you make a note of your installation directory so you don't have to go hunt it up again. So here's a screenshot of that. And then the next step we talked about was to install the Android SDK. And again, we have step-by-step instructions on where to go to download it and the steps to install it. Here we're saying install it wherever you like, but try to avoid the program files directory, just like we discussed in the module. And then here we're going in and configuring the Android home environment variable, just like we did the Java. So there's a screenshot of configuring that environment variable. And then here's the auto configure Android SDK. So that's the part that may take a while. All right, it's going to go out there and look for updates and actually install those updates. If you get prompts, I think you will get at least one prompt. You can answer the prompts with the default. And then here we're selecting the Android virtual device. It's x86 configuration we talked about earlier. And here we're creating the virtual device. Again, here you can also just accept the defaults. And I mentioned earlier that after you create the virtual device, we now require you to install Hexum, this Hardware Accelerated Execution Manager. So there's the instructions for installing that. If you're using Mac, you will need to install a hotfix, so we've got the URL for that. And then here's where you're launching the emulator. It may take a minute or so the first time to finish loading. It's much faster, though, than if you didn't install Hexum. And you'll know it's finished when it looks like that, right? When it looks like the screenshot, so a device screen. So now your emulator is running. It's launched and running. You're ready to do exercise 3, which is deploy Genero Mobile for Android. Here they're checking to make sure that it allows installation from unknown sources. And that's the check mark that you're looking for right there by unknown sources. And then you're ready to actually do the deploy. So back in Genero Studio, you're going to select Tools, Android Tools, Deploy Genero Mobile. Once that's finished, you're ready to go. Right? You just want to test and make sure that everything works. And a good test of that is to open up Genero Studio, and in the Welcome page, there is a Office Store mobile project. And it's a demo project so that you can see some how mobile applications look and some of the functionality. So what you might do is open that up and execute it, and then bring up your emulator and make sure you're able to see the app or run the app in that emulator. You should be able to view the screens. And that's it. Once you've finished that, you're finished with Lab 2, which is actually your first lab, and you're ready to go for tomorrow.